It's a really bizarre position for Russia to find itself in, where it's so alienated from the West and yet increasingly dependent on a country that it still to some degree distrusts, and I think to a possibly quite significant degree.
Vladimir Putin has said he's reached understandings with Donald Trump over the end of the Ukraine war during their meeting last month. He was speaking during a summit in China where world leaders such as Xi Jinping, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Turkish President Recep Erdogan have been talking together. Here is the Russian leader earlier.
Мы широко ценим усилия и предложения.
We value the efforts and propositions to solve the Ukrainian crisis of China, India and other strategic partners of ours. The mutual understanding that was reached at a recent Russia-US summit in Alaska heads the same direction, I hope. It paves the way to peace in Ukraine, I hope. I will inform my colleagues in more detail on the results of talks in Alaska during our bilateral meetings today and tomorrow.
John Lough is a former NATO representative to Russia and head of foreign policy at the New Eurasian Strategies Centre. Good evening to you, John.
Good evening.
A bit of behind-the-scenes context here from Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. We don't know what those understandings are, do we, really, with the US President Donald Trump? Is this Vladimir Putin talking himself up somewhat amongst some of the countries that he considers his allies? We've got some very mighty nations, haven't we, taking part in this Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit?
Yeah, this is like the kind of the alternative G20 meeting, I guess. And the Chinese have a very strong interest here in pushing their objectives of strengthening their role in the international system. And they see Russia as a useful ally here, a country that is, in fact, becoming increasingly dependent on them. I think Putin was at pains to show that he got this meeting with Trump, that to some extent he's been rehabilitated now. And one has to consider that he is an indicted war criminal. At least he's wanted on war crimes charges by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And it was a big deal for him to go to Alaska and meet with Trump, to be so warmly received. And also, I think, to really impress on Trump, his version of events, which is that Ukraine is and its Western allies are responsible for this war. And to some extent, Trump and even some people around him, echo that message. Trump seems to stick to this policy of kind of moral equivalence between Russia and Ukraine, not really wanting to be anything more at this stage other than some sort of neutral arbiter. So I think Putin was keen to repeat his usual messages. There was nothing particularly new in what he said about the war and, in fact, what he's expecting to happen, which I think is he's expecting to continue to fight. And he continually argues that NATO poses a threat to Russia and that Ukraine's admission to NATO would be impermissible, but Trump's already given ground on that.
Correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I think today was meant to be the deadline, wasn't it, for Putin's response to holding peace talks with Volodymyr Zelensky?
Yes, I believe so, but there's no possibility of that happening short term. What Putin wants to do is to impose a peace settlement on Ukraine. And at that point, I think he'll be prepared to speak to Zelensky. But as long as Ukraine retains the will to fight and to resist, as it's currently doing, there's no possibility of the two leaders meeting, in my view.
I noted that within the last week, President Zelensky, after that huge attack on Kyiv by Russia, he implored Hungary to help him out, and their leader, probably seen as the most sort of favourable towards Donald Trump. He implored for their help in trying to find a resolution to the end of the war. And he also implored upon China as well, which struck me as, well, it is an option. But China are clearly aligned with Russia, and we heard from Putin today a word of thanks to both the Chinese and Indian leaders for their support and their efforts, he said, to facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian crisis. Where does China stand truly, do you think?
My impression is that the Chinese don't like what they're seeing. They didn't expect Putin to get stuck in a long or mired in a long war in Ukraine. He probably gave them the impression that this would be over pretty quickly. And many people, many Western leaders, of course, also believed at the time that Ukrainians would not be able to put up this type of resistance. The Chinese certainly don't want to see the Russians defeated. And for that reason, they have supported them in quite significant ways, not with military equipment as such, but with technology that is making it possible for the defense industry in particular to continue functioning in conditions of very severe Western sanctions. And they're also buying, significant volumes of oil, which is helping to sustain Russia's revenues. So the Chinese talk peace, but in reality, they are, of course, enabling the Russian war machine. But the the fact remains they don't want to see Russia defeated. That would run counter to their agenda. There has been some speculation that they tried to rein Putin in over this, nuclear rhetoric that he was employing in the early stages of the war, and which he periodically returns to. I don't think there's any firm evidence to support that. But I don't think equally the Chinese would like to see this war escalate further. And one thing they would need to be concerned about is whether long term this will in fact consolidate the NATO alliance. With President Trump in power, it doesn't look that way, but NATO is still there. The European members are starting to do their bit. And maybe a future US president will be, in fact, more supportive of NATO and maintaining US alliances. And when you think of the role that China wishes to play in the Asia-Pacific region, where it wants to be the dominant player to force the US out, with all sorts of implications for Japan, South Korea, Australia, or other US allies in the region, then we have entered this period of extreme instability in international affairs, which the Chinese perfectly well understand. And they have this, longer term view of how events can develop. And they're playing, I think, a really quite clever, systematic game. And it doesn't mean to say that Russia is a country they feel especially well disposed to. I think Russia is useful to them. But Russia is also making itself vulnerable by becoming so dependent on them. I mean, you just have to look at, obviously, at the population numbers, the border, historical interests, and it's a really bizarre position for Russia to find itself in, where it's so alienated from the West, and yet increasingly dependent on a country that it still, to some degree, distrusts, and I think to a possibly quite significant degree. We just don't know enough about the inner workings. But on the surface, it all looks, very happy and successful.
India are at this summit, as we've said, and they are also a really big buyer of Russian crude oil. They've been penalised by Donald Trump for that. That US tariff of 50% imposed last week came into operation last week, and today and yesterday we saw Narendra Modi of India all smiles and handshakes. It looked very jovial between Putin and Xi Jinping and Modi. Here we have an interesting position from India here, who are probably the leading nation out of all of these to have had a good relationship with Donald Trump, yet be portraying a message alongside China and Russia potentially that they don't need Mr. Trump, that they represent a different sort of power. I'm sure they'd like to think a new world order.
Well, indeed. I mean, this is absolutely fascinating, what's happening with the Indians. I mean, I'm not an expert on US-India relations. But, what I can see is that the US over 30 years invested huge effort in building up relations with India as a hedge against China. So you've had a lot of US investment, US companies involved in India, making it, their production center, and it was a perfectly logical policy. And then for President Trump to impose tariffs at this level on the Indians, when they were expecting to probably get some sort of trade deal akin to what Britain ended up with, 15%, down from 25% tariffs to begin with, then, to find themselves where they're singled out and punished in this way, they seemingly have no other option than, in fact, to cozy up to the Chinese. And they have a historic relationship with the Russians, which has been quite close from the Soviet era. And you just have to think that 4 years ago, on the Himalayan border, the Indians and the Chinese were, fighting it out. There were soldiers on both sides who died during a border incident. So relations have been extremely difficult. So the fact that within just a matter of a few weeks, as a result of his tariff policy, Donald Trump could have brought about a situation where these two countries actually appear to see the need to reconcile their differences and to start rebuilding relations. It's a phenomenal achievement.
Yeah. It is quite some axis to think about, isn't it, here, and how Donald Trump plays his part in it, and whether he's eyes wide open to that in alienating other states. And look, I'm sure that's why we hear mixed messages from him on Russia and on China, and why, interestingly, India hasn't really retaliated to that additional tariff from Donald Trump. And so you wonder whether they're keeping their cards close to their chest, or just the display of affection between these mighty leaders. Their population, India, Russia and China, they've got a combined population of 3 billion, 40% of humanity. So when you think about that, it is utterly fascinating. Look, thank you for being with us and talking it through. John Lough, former NATO representative to Russia and head of foreign policy at the New Eurasian Strategist Centre. Good to have you on. Thank you.